Hello everyone, I am Gizem Yılmazel, an instructor of EAP and PhD candidate at Middle East Technical University in Turkey. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to a very special session, an interview with Dr. Darla Deardorff. We're truly honored to have with us a pioneering figure whose work has had a profound impact on how we understand and cultivate intercultural competence in education across the globe. Also, on behalf of the organizing committee of METU NCC ELT Workshop Festival, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Deardorff for graciously accepting my invitation and contributing to the success of our event with her valuable insights and presence. So, whether you are here as a language teacher, a researcher, a curriculum developer, or simply someone passionate about intercultural dialogue, I invite you to listen, reflect, and engage as we explore new perspectives and strategies for nurturing intercultural understanding in language education. So, without further delay, let's now turn to a conversation with our esteemed guest, Dr. Darla Deardorff. Hello, Darla.
Hello, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you. And hello to everyone there. I wish I could be in person, but unfortunately, that's not probably going to be possible. So I'm glad we can at least be together in this way.
Great. Okay. So I'm just directly starting without losing time. Your work has significantly shaped the field of intercultural competence in education. What inspired you to develop a framework on intercultural competences? How has your understanding of intercultural learning evolved since its inception?
So really the basic question behind my research and what has driven me all along is this question around what is necessary for us to get along together as humans sharing this one planet. So that's kind of the burning question for me. And in academia, that can be translated into intercultural competence. And I have been working mostly in the field of international education and saw that intercultural competence is essentially at the core of international education and developing intercultural competence in our students and in ourselves. And I also saw that there were a lot of different scholars putting out different definitions, but there was no research-based definition on intercultural competence. And so I was curious to see if these scholars and experts could reach consensus on a definition of intercultural competence.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where it all started. And for those who do research, I use a Delphi methodology, which
Mhm.
is a quasi-quantitative qualitative methodology. And happy to have you contact me if you want to know more about that. But the good news is that the experts in the study did reach consensus, and that's what you
Mhm.
see in the framework. In terms of how my understanding of intercultural competence has evolved, for about the last decade or so, I've been working with uh, global organizations, particularly the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the United Nations through UNESCO. And in both of those entities, I would say that the definition of intercultural competence has expanded
Mhm.
from when I originally did the research. Um, when I was doing the research on intercultural competence, there was much more reference to intercultural differences, cultural differences, and now I would say, particularly at the global level, it's intercultural competence is looking at interactions across difference, whatever those differences may be. So it's expanded out to include how do we connect with those who are of different genders, different generations, languages, religious beliefs, socioeconomic backgrounds, whatever those differences might be. So
Mhm.
it's not strictly limited to only culture,
Sure.
recognizing that we all belong to multiple groups. And so it's important to understand how we can connect across all the different groups to which we belong.
That then intercultural competence is becoming increasingly important in language education, especially in English as a foreign language contexts. Could you briefly inform us about the intercultural competence model that you developed and how it could be utilized in EFL settings?
So first I need to say that I actually come out of an EFL background. I
Mhm,
taught English as a second language for many years
mhm,
to adults in the United States and also in Japan and some in Germany. And and then I also, for a number of years, worked in a program at Duke University that trained ESL and EFL teachers.
mhm,
And of course, the intercultural competence courses were some of the main ones I taught in that program.
mhm,
And so, in terms of the intercultural competence model, first of all, um, competence is generally defined as knowledge, skills, and attitudes. That's a basic definition of competence. But I wanted to know what knowledge, what skills, what attitudes.
mhm.
And so that was in working with the experts in my study, they did agree on some key elements under each of those.
Mhm.
Uh, for example, attitudes is a foundational piece, a starting point.
Sure.
And there were three key attitudes that emerged, that of openness, respect, and curiosity.
Mhm.
Respect being absolutely essential, meaning that we value each other as fellow human beings, especially those who don't think like we do or look like we do. So that's a really key piece, and those attitudes are requisite for then being able to develop further knowledge or skills. And so there are some specific knowledge components, including cultural self-awareness, and some specific skills components, including listening, and not just any kind of listening, but listening for understanding
Mhm.
instead of response. Now, those together, once persons are developing these knowledge, skills, and attitudes, then what happens is there's an internal change in ourselves that we hopefully will become more adaptable,
Mhm.
more flexible in how we communicate and behave. And
Mhm.
that's in the model, it's considered to be an internal outcome. And then the external outcome is essentially a summarized definition of intercultural competence, which is the behavior and communication
Mhm.
that is effective and appropriate across difference. And the words effective and appropriate are both very important. A
Mhm.
lot of intercultural literature talks about effectiveness,
Mhm.
particularly business literature, but that's only half of the picture. We know whether we've been effective or not, whether we've met our goals or not. But intercultural competence plays a key role in the appropriateness of how we went about meeting our goals. So
Mhm.
that's the other half of the picture. And that's the important piece for all of us to remember, and particularly for teachers
Sure.
in EFL settings, is looking at how we as teachers can model
Mhm.
effective and appropriate
Mhm.
intercultural competence. It's really important that teachers model that and not just talk about it. Um, and there are a number of ways to develop that. And it's important to recognize that actually developing intercultural competence is a lifelong process, that there's no point at which any of us can say we're interculturally competent,
Mhm.
even though there are some who might think, well, I speak several languages and I've lived in several countries, so I'm interculturally competent. Not necessarily.
Mhm.
And it is indeed a lifelong process. And then, so first of all, teachers need to model
Mhm.
effective and appropriate intercultural competence in the classroom. Second, it's really important that in the classroom, we go beyond knowledge transfer.
Mhm.
It's so much more than knowledge, as you heard from my brief outline of the framework.
Mhm.
But it's important that we're also working with our students on the attitudes and on the necessary skills needed for intercultural competence. What's interesting to me is that there was only one element that, at least in this particular research, that the experts could not agree on fully.
Mhm.
And that was the role of language in intercultural competence. And of course, I'm a bit biased. Why can't they agree on this? That seems pretty important, particularly in communication. But in response, the experts said that there are so many cases of fluent fools of
Mhm.
those who know the grammar and vocabulary of
Mhm.
another language, but they're interculturally incompetent in navigating in their own social, cultural context. And that can even be true for those speaking the first language.
Mhm.
We can probably think of fluent fools even in our own social context where persons are not as appropriate as they could be in
Mhm.
how they go about achieving their goals. So I think there's a lot that can be taken from the intercultural competence framework for teachers, both in their own teaching practice and in the content itself. But it's got to be more than just teaching a language.
Of course. So I wish I was able to attend your classes back when, while you were teaching. But still, I'm benefiting from your studies, your papers, or everything you just put into the literature, let's say. And besides, yeah, the things you mentioned, like openness, respect, empathy, such things are quite rigid. So we can just like somehow observe it. So this is what makes your framework different from the things in the literature. And then after on, let's move into the assessment side of it. While many institutions aim to foster intercultural understanding, assessing such competence remains a complex task. So, how can institutions measure intercultural competence effectively without reducing it to a checklist or oversimplified rubrics?
Or I would even say one pre and post measure, because that is insufficient in
Mhm.
assessing intercultural competence. So this was also part of my research.
Mhm.
I wanted to see if the experts agreed if if intercultural competence could even be assessed, because
Mhm.
that was a question out there as well.
Of course.
And I was very pleased to see that yes, they agreed that it could be assessed. However, it needed, if we're assessing intercultural competence, it will always remain a complex task if we are serious about doing rigorous assessment of intercultural competence, because it needs to be a multi-perspective,
Mhm.
multi-measure approach to assessment, which is why one tool is insufficient. It can be part of what we do, but it needs to be so much more. Several pieces around assessing. First of all, um, I think many people like to start with the question of what tool should I use?
Mhm.
That's actually much further down the list. The first question to ask is why? Why
Mhm.
do you want to assess?
Mhm.
And depending on the response to why, you may not need to assess, because assessment is about providing feedback to the learner so they
Mhm.
can continue to grow and develop.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, when I ask universities why they want to assess, they say, well, because we want to see if our program is working and we want to improve our program.
Mhm.
Okay, that's an entirely different matter. That is program evaluation,
Mhm.
not outcomes assessment. And it involves very different processes. So again, the why, starting with why is very, very important. And if there's not an answer to that, then my response is why bother? Then
Mhm.
why bother even assessing if you don't have a clear answer to the why?
Mhm.
And for assessment, it needs to be to give that feedback to students, to the learners, so they can continue to grow and develop. Um, with that being said, so first question is why. Second question is what? What
Mhm.
is it exactly that you want to assess about intercultural competence? Because intercultural competence is a goal. It can be a part of the goal if we want to develop more intercultural competence in our students. But goals are too broad to assess.
Mhm.
And so then we need to break those down into specific measurable learning outcomes or objectives.
Mhm.
Those are what we assess. And with those specific learning outcomes, we need to ask ourselves, what's the evidence that this outcome has been achieved?
Mhm.
And what's the best way to collect that evidence? It may or may not be through some pre-post instrument. Because in the end, and this is really important to remember, it's not about the tools, it's about collecting evidence of change.
Mhm.
Evidence of change. And there are some very simple ways to do that, actually, that doesn't involve tools. At Harvard, and I'll be teaching a summer course at Harvard this summer,
Mhm.
there's a whole body of work around making thinking visible. It's available on a website. It's a wonderful toolbox.
Mhm.
One of those tools in making thinking visible is simply having students reflect on this phrase. I used to think, now I think.
Mm.
That demonstrates change. And you can quantify the qualitative because so if you're about numbers, no problem. You can make numbers out of qualitative data that you collect. So again, it's about a focus on evidence and collecting the evidence, not on the tools. And in the end, if we are serious about assessing intercultural competence, it needs to be a multi-measure, multi-perspective approach.
Mhm.
Given the appropriateness piece, only the other can determine whether we've been appropriate or not. So we
Mhm.
must have a multiple perspective approach in assessment.
Yeah, it's still so complex.
It
There are
is very
so many
complex, and
things
there
to
is
consider.
no easy way to do it. I know
I
many
know.
people are looking for that, but there is no easy way to assess intercultural competence, and we need to make sure we use the data we collect to provide feedback to the students. There's a currently much more of an emphasis on formative assessment, meaning
Mhm.
collecting evidence during the learning experience, and not as much on the pre and post, because that's more difficult to provide the feedback to students.
Mhm.
Um, and so again, it can be part of it, but in the end, it's much more of an emphasis on formative. It
Mhm.
also, there needs to be a mindset change around assessment because too often we think about assessment as something we do to learners. And in
Mhm.
this case, it's something we are doing with learners. They need to be co-creators in
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
In some of my courses, I do present some learning objectives, but then one of the first assignments is for students to tell me at least two of their own learning objectives within the context of the course and how they're going to meet those learning objectives and what the evidence will be that they have met them. And then we
Mhm.
we touch base on that throughout the entire course, and at the end, they have to show that
Mhm.
they have met or not their own learning objectives. So it needs to be more of a co-created approach
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
intercultural competence. There's an increased use of peer assessment. So there's a lot that we need to think about when it comes to intercultural competence assessment. I have indeed written and published a lot on it. So a lot of that's available online that you can just read. And there's also a whole book that I wrote
Mhm.
on
Sure.
assessing um, international education learning outcomes, particularly intercultural competence. And I should mention the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence, which is a global nonprofit with
Mhm.
over 5,000 colleagues from around the world in the World Council. There are over 20 different working groups within the World Council, and anyone's welcome to join. It's free to join.
Mhm.
Um, and one of those working groups is on ICC assessment. And so that group delves much further into these questions that we're considering around assessing intercultural competence.
Mhm. Yeah, although it's complex, we just at least have some components to consider and think about during the process, which would definitely facilitate our job. And when it comes to the methodology, one of your notable contributions in collaboration with UNESCO is the development of the story circles methodology. Could you also briefly inform the audience about the story circles technique and how it could be employed in English language teaching classrooms?
Sure. So this is very much coming from UNESCO. You're right. I worked with them on developing this intercultural methodology because they wanted to find a intercultural methodology for developing intercultural competence
Mhm.
that could be used with any group of people anywhere in the world
Mhm.
using little to no resources,
Mhm.
and that could be facilitated by almost anyone, certainly teachers. That there didn't need to be some kind of special training or background in intercultural communication. And I had been doing intercultural training for years and even co-authored a book on 50 some different activities that can be used, and none of those fit the criteria.
Mhm.
And so we engaged in a series of focus groups and interviews around the world. And what emerged were two things. One, the sharing of our own personal life experience and sharing those in circles, hence UNESCO story circles. We recognize that circles have existed in indigenous cultures around the world for centuries, And there may even be other types of story circles. So that's why we like to make sure we say UNESCO story circles. And UNESCO story circles were piloted in all 5 UNESCO regions around the world just pre-pandemic,
Mhm.
and to see if do they really work with any group of people anywhere. And the good news is yes, it was incredible how well they worked, how impactful they are. Only one of those 5 pilots was in a formal learning setting. That was with middle school students in Vienna, Austria,
Mhm.
where most of those students were of immigrant background and German was their second language.
Mhm.
Um, and 2 of the 5 pilots were literally held outside under trees, the one in San Jose, Costa Rica, and the one in Harare, Zimbabwe. And we're done with community groups. In Costa Rica, a group of indigenous leaders, and then in Harare, we worked with at-risk young people. And it was just so powerful to see UNESCO Story Circles in action. For those who are not familiar with it, it is a structured yet adaptable methodology. The structured part is that there is a specific UNESCO protocol that needs to be followed.
Mhm.
It involves 3 rounds in once persons are in circles. And all of this is outlined in an open access manual from UNESCO that is downloadable in at least 7 different languages. And so I encourage everyone to have a look at that downloadable open access manual. We have found that UNESCO story circles work best in groups of 4 to 6 people, no fewer than 4, no more than 6. And you do not have a facilitator in the groups. There's one facilitator that provides the guidelines, that provides the protocol, the instructions, and then debriefs at the end.
Mhm.
And for that reason, it's also very scalable. I like to say that usually I worry more about the lower numbers. I like to have at least 8 participants so we can have 2 groups of 4. But there is no end to how many can participate. And in fact, just a couple weeks ago, I was in Argentina and facilitated UNESCO Story Circles at a conference for over 1,000 participants. There was even an overflow room, and one of my colleagues was there just to help assist with Story Circles
Mhm.
there. So it's truly amazing to see how this works. And when the pandemic came along, we found out that we could also do these online. And so we used, during the pandemic, we used UNESCO Story Circles to train United Nations staff, UNHCR staff that work with refugees, and even peacekeepers in Mali.
Mhm.
And one UN staff member in Brazil said it was the most impactful experience she had had during the entire time of the pandemic. And she didn't realize she could have that through a computer screen.
Mhm.
It takes about 90 minutes to run a UNESCO Story Circle experience.
Mhm.
And what we've seen is that the outcomes from those 90 minutes far exceed the outcomes of a half to full day intercultural training. So it's just a very powerful, impactful tool. And in terms of using it in the classroom, when I teach, I always like to use UNESCO Story Circles at the very beginning of a course. And it's a way to build community. And students refer to that all of the rest of the course because it becomes somewhat of a touchstone. When students are doing this in a language not their own, I know some teachers say, well, I like to give the prompts. There's specific intercultural prompts that we use, not just anything, not just talk about an exciting time in your life. That's not an appropriate prompt for UNESCO Story Circles. The ones that we use most often, the first round is a icebreaker round. The one we use most often is to say your name in 3 words or phrases about your identity and why those words or phrases are important to you. And there's a time limit. The one we use most often is that should be done in 2 minutes or less. And then the next round is at the heart of this story circle methodology. It's an intercultural prompt. Specifically, the one that we've used most often is to tell about a specific memorable time you've had with someone different from you
Mhm.
and what you learned about yourself
Mhm.
and or the other person. Um, and that's to be told in 3 minutes or less. Again, it's adaptable because you can select other prompts to use, and the manual has quite a few other examples of prompts. So the facilitator can select the most appropriate prompts and can adapt the time limit too. But you need to calculate that out to make sure you have enough time. So it's 90 minutes using the suggested time I mentioned here. The third round is very important to do as well. It's called the flashback round.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I mean by protocol. None of these can be skipped.
Mm-hmm.
And the flashback round is where participants go around and focus on one person, like for example, the person who started, and all the rest of the members would go around and say the most memorable part of your story for me was this. Not the best part. It's not evaluative. It's just what was memorable. And they're not supposed to say why. Just name the memorable part. That has been a very transformational round for many participants. And in fact, one young man said it was the first time in his life that he had ever felt heard.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be very, very impactful. Um, and then after those three rounds, then there can be more of that free-flowing conversation. But up until that point, it's very important that participants practice listening for understanding,
Mm-hmm.
meaning they do not ask questions, they do not comment, they do not interrupt. They
Mm-hmm.
are listening for understanding only, no responses, verbal responses. So then for language teachers, sometimes they'll say, well, I'd like to give those prompts in advance.
Mm-hmm.
UNESCO does not recommend that
Hmm.
because what was found is that students will spend a lot of time writing it out, maybe memorizing it or bringing it and reading it, and then it's no longer authentic.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And so instead, what language teachers are moving more toward, and really it should be done with anyone who's any group, not just language learners, is to allow a few minutes or more
Mm-hmm.
after each prompt to say, take a few minutes, think about what you'll say, and just pause, give a few minutes or more, and let them collect their thoughts then.
Mm-hmm.
And then you give them the second round, here's your prompt. Again, allow them a few minutes so that it can be more authentic and in the moment and not well rehearsed and prepared, which in some ways defeats the purpose of UNESCO story circles. So that's a little bit about the methodology. There is also an online 2.5 minute video
Mm-hmm.
made by UNESCO to introduce story circles. So anyone is welcome to take a look at that. They'll give you a really good sense of UNESCO story circles. That's also available in 3 languages. And
Mm-hmm.
so I encourage anyone to have a look at that video and then to download the manual. And I will mention then the largest group of UNESCO story circle facilitators can be found in the World Council. There's a whole group of facilitators. We meet quarterly
Mm-hmm.
and share with each other some of our experiences, ask each other questions. Like someone was saying, oh, I'm going to go facilitate this with a group of teenagers. What recommendations can you give? And then others jump in and share their experiences. So encourage those who do facilitate UNESCO Story Circles to also join the group at the World Council and hope to see some of you
Yeah.
at the quarterly meetings. So that's a little bit about UNESCO Story Circles.
Great. Yeah. Greatly explained. And we just have the image in our minds, I guess. So it's basically, I was going to tell you that besides raising intercultural awareness and like trying to help them build that competence, there is also too many other benefits. Like this can be utilized in language classes so that students can practice speaking. I mean, they can practice sharing some personal stories as well. So it serves many different objectives, actually.
Absolutely, many different objectives. And in addition, I mean, the purpose of these circles was to practice and develop
Mhm.
some of these key intercultural competencies that we've been speaking about. However, like you said, there are many other amazing results or outcomes. It helps to bridge divides. We've used, for
Mhm.
example, UNESCO story circles in Northern Ireland
Mhm.
in a divided society where participants were equally from Protestant and Catholic backgrounds. In some cases, that was the first time they'd ever even spoken to someone from the other
Mm.
side,
Mm.
and they were amazed at how much they could see themselves in others. And in the end, oftentimes it's a recognition that we share more and we
Mhm.
have more in common than what divides us.
Sure.
So they've been used all over the world in lots of different contexts,
Mhm.
and look forward to hearing about
Mhm.
participants' experiences here with UNESCO Story Circles.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing the details. Then, last but not least, educators are continually seeking practical strategies to cultivate intercultural competence in language learners. Could you share any additional methods or techniques beyond your existing ones, of course, that you recommend for enhancing intercultural competencies of language learners?
So nothing substitutes for real life interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was teaching English as a second language, I would have some assignments where my students had to go out and interact with
Mm-hmm.
um, English language speakers. Not so they're not just interacting with themselves, but there was a specific structured assignment around that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I was teaching in the same building with other language courses, and so for example, the Spanish as a second language teacher and I got together and brought our two classes together so they could practice like the speaking English
Mm-hmm.
or Spanish because quite a few of my students also spoke Spanish. So there are lots of different creative ways to have those real life experiences for your students, but I definitely encourage that, not just have them stay in the classroom
Sure.
if at all possible, because those more experiential learning opportunities can be even more impactful.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I would encourage us to think about other perspectives on intercultural competence. As a UNESCO chairholder on intercultural competence
Mm-hmm.
at a South African university,
Mm-hmm.
we are very keen to identify and elevate African voices, perspectives, and practices around intercultural competence because this has for far too long been dominated by those in the global north. And I acknowledge that I'm a white woman from the global north. And so I am remain very eager to learn from my colleagues in South Africa and the continent about other perspectives on intercultural competence. And one of the co-chairs with my chair at Stellenbosch is Dr. Precious Simba, and her area of research and work is on Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm.
And Ubuntu is a different way of looking at this because too often in the global north, we're focused on the individual. But Ubuntu talks about I am because we are, and we are because I am. That the individual cannot be separated from the we.
Mm-hmm.
And what we each do impacts the other.
Sure.
And so the interdependence and the interrelationships become very important. And so as part of the UNESCO chair team, then we are working on developing concrete methods and techniques around Ubuntu. So stay tuned. We'll be publishing that. We're working on it now, and we'll have a book coming out around that so that there can be much more practical strategies for developing intercultural competence. And I did mention a colleague and I, she's now a VP at Meta and doing intercultural training there. She and I put together a book several years ago with over 50 different activities
Mm-hmm.
as ways to cultivate intercultural competence. And that so that's certainly available as a resource. And there are many other wonderful resources, including there's quite a few downloadable free resources from Council of Europe. One of
Mm-hmm.
them is called Tasks for Democracy, capital letters TASK. And they have a wealth of different intercultural tools there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a database in the United States at Purdue that also is searchable and has lots of different tools called the Hubicle. And then, of course, the World Council is a
Mm-hmm.
great resource for different strategies. The working groups present and share a lot on this question. So
Well,
lots of different resources for that.
yeah. Mhm. Well, thanks for sharing them, though. That's like a really huge bulk of resources that you've just mentioned. Thank you. And I took my notes regarding your framework, the manual of the story circles, and the video for story circles. I'm going to put them to the end of our session so that people can benefit from them as well. And
Excellent.
that was my last question. We're just running out of time. Yeah, anyways, let's conclude then. As we conclude, we're deeply grateful for the opportunity to have heard directly from Dr. Deardorff, gaining insight into the inspirations behind her groundbreaking framework, the evolution of her thinking, the practical implications for our classrooms. So her contributions today have not only deepened our understanding, but have also challenged us to reflect on one of the most pressing issues in our field, assessing intercultural competence in ways that are both meaningful and authentic. Thank you all for being a part of this enriching experience, and thank you very much to Darla Deardorff for sparing some time to us. That's just like, I don't know, that's too much to tell, too much to thank you for. Thanks for being with us today.
You're very welcome, and I look forward to hopefully keeping in touch with all of you. I'm on LinkedIn, and certainly through the UNESCO Chair World Council, so hopefully we can stay in contact.
I'll be also sharing your contact details.
Great.
Thank you very much once again.